At 22:16 hours, we got a call that a man was acting erratically in the store. He was acting like a maniac. When we arrived on the scene, the store had been emptied of its customers because of the behavior of this gentleman. It took us a while to control the situation, and there was some frustration involved. We've had 3 incidences this week. I wouldn't go as far as to say epidemic. They're annoying.
When I was 4 years old, my family upgraded from the cartridge-playing Super Nintendo to the sleek and sophisticated PlayStation 1. And along with this console came the evolution of my gaming experience. Among the first batch of games for my new PS1 were Spyro the Dragon, Rayman, and Crash Bandicoot. I have this very vivid memory of being super impressed with the discs that contain the games over the blocky cartridges of games past. So impressed, in fact, I decided to show my mother my fascination with the new flexible CDs. I took my copy of Crash Bandicoot out of the PlayStation and I ran up to her with it. While demonstrating my amazement, I bent this CD in a V shape right in front of her, and in an instant my giddy smile turned into a frown of shock when I snapped that disc right in half. My mother could only chuckle with that "see what you did" vibe, and she threw up her arms, and I was so sad because I hadn't even beaten that game yet. It would be more than 10 years before I got a copy of that game again. By the time we got around to replacing it, the sequel, Crash 2 Cortex Strikes Back, was already out, so we just picked up a copy of that instead. And I treat it like holy scripture to this day. Now, I don't remember too much of playing Crash 1. I remember some of the set pieces, and I played the intro sequence enough times to quote it line for line from memory. Aside from that, I only really remember despising the saving system for this game above all else. But we'll get into that later. What I do remember is getting the true ending for Crash 2, where all of the secret pickups are, and all of the hidden paths lay pretty well. Crash Bandicoot 2 was my childhood platformer. If there was one game I could play over and over again and enjoy every single time without fail, it's Crash 2. And I imagine a fair bit of you also have a game like this, and it might even be a Crash Bandicoot game. It wasn't until way later in life that I had the capability to play all 3 mainline Crash games in succession that I was able to determine the quality of each game and compare them to each other. You see, while I have fond memories of different quality among each, I think there's some give and take to each game. Crash 1 has this adorable charm and sets up a wonderful franchise with revolutionary technical achievements. Crash 2 opens up their world with a more polished setup and introduces more complex gameplay. Crash 3 takes everything created in the previous 2 games, solidifies the Crash formula, and makes it all backflip off a frickin' motorcycle. So let's put these gaming classics under the microscope and figure out just what exactly a Wumpa fruit tastes like. My name's Matthias, I like video games, and these are Crash Bandicoot's Sequelogical Tendencies. Alright, so like, Crash Bandicoot is a game about jumping over pits and property damage. Also, there's this fruit. And it has voodoo masks. And it's awesome. Each Crash game has varying locations, but they mostly maintain the same general premise. Navigate a linear path through a stage, collecting fruits and crystals, hit a bonus stage, and exit through a portal. Every few stages, you need to defeat a boss enemy of some kind to progress. In Crash 1, its boss encounters don't really have a set encounter rate. For the sequels, players can expect to fight a boss every 5 portal warp room. In the first game, Crash can run, jump, and spin attack, simple controls used in some creative ways later on. Crash 2 would introduce some additional maneuvers like crouching, sliding, and the high jump. If you press the crouch button while mid-air, you'll do a belly flop onto the ground, damaging enemies and breaking these reinforced crates. Each of these are used in different parts of the game to progress in some fashion. Crash 3 introduced power-up abilities gained after each boss fight. These power-ups include a double jump, a super belly flop, an enhanced spin move, and a Wumpa-fueled bazooka. Just like in Crash 2, each of these power-ups provide expanded gameplay elements to future levels. Certain obstacles that would seem impossible for normal approach are only passable if you integrate these power-ups into your regular gameplay. And while most of these mechanics wouldn't be fully fleshed out until later games, Crash 1 takes a lot of pride in making sure that the main gameplay loop works, and works well. The jumping and spin attacks are simple, but the game takes full advantage of these mechanics by the end of it. But for now, it's mainly used for yeeting yourself over bottomless pits and dodging rolling rock wheels. Along each level are these little apple, peach, fruit things called Wumpa fruit, the game's de facto pick-me-up. Collect 100 of these and you'll gain a life, which is super important in the first game, so grab as many of these as you can find. Spin attack these crates here and you'll crack open a bunch of collectible items. Wumpa fruit, lives, invincibility masks, and in the first game, bonus stage tokens come out of these with different symbols for each different crate contents. Just don't attack these red and green crates, they're instant death traps. You can jump on top of these TNT crates to get them to start an explosion timer. When the beeping noise speeds up and the counter hits 1, it'll explode, giving you a limited window of escape. In later levels, TNT crates are sometimes used as part of puzzles to clear the path forward, or used against enemies you wouldn't otherwise defeat with a spin attack. Nitro crates are just straight up bad juju. They explode on contact and are always used as roadblocks to force you to approach a path differently. Your lives are represented by the face of Crash and sit in the top right of the screen. That's some mugshot, Crash. I bet that looks great on your driver's license. Meet Aku Aku. He's a protector of sorts, a witch doctor's mask that follows you around like a lost puppy. When you collect him once, you can take a hit of damage and give yourself some invincibility frames. Collect him a second time, you're allowed 2 hits. Collect him thrice and you're imbued with the purest crackhead energy in the universe. In this state, you're invincible to any damage with the exception of the bottomless pits. If it's your first playthrough of this game, it may take some time to actually build up 3 masks. Crash 1 has a rapid difficulty spike, but we'll get to that later. These bonus stage tokens are represented by heads of different characters you're introduced to. Collect 3 of each face token to be teleported instantly to a bonus stage. In the sequels, bonus stages are either these platforms that take you off screen or through the ground to another part of the level. When you're taken away to a bonus stage, you're essentially in a little pocket dimension, separate from the rest of the gameplay. There's a certain number of Wumpa, crates, and collectibles in every bonus stage with a transport of some kind at the end to bring you back to the actual level. There's no life loss if you get blown up or fall into a pit in these levels, however only Crash 2 and 3 let you try the bonus stage over repeatedly if you fail. If you die in a bonus stage in Crash 1, you are just teleported out instantly and cannot try it again unless you start the level over. Which doesn't sound too terrible at first, but it's actually a pretty crazy oversight, because, well, here's why this is a stinky pile of Bandicoot shite. In Crash 1, the only way for you to save your progress is to either obtain a gem by collecting all of the boxes in the level, which means completing it flawlessly on your first try, or by completing a bonus stage. You cannot save from the main menu, and there is no checkpoint system, which means if you have made significant progress and want to hang it up for the day, you have to go into the stage that you have already played and either complete it on your first try flawlessly, or find all of the face tokens of a specific face and reach the end of the bonus stage to get there. You're then either given the option to generate a password or save your game file to your memory card. This is completely asinine, and I have no idea why they created the game to work this way. There is so much going on in every level, and the levels get so long in the end game that this archaic saving system gets really old really fast. Thankfully, this is one of the first things they fixed in the sequels. Starting in Crash 2, you only need to get back to the central warp room and stand in front of this panel. You'll be given the option to pick a memory card and a save file to use, and while this was long before the days of an autosave, this is probably the best form of saving your progress you could get. It's such a godsend to be able to complete a level that was really difficult, took a long time to complete, hop out and then save your progress, not having to worry about making sure to find every token and then not die in the trial and error design of most of these bonus rounds, to be able to even save your progress. I know that when even more than movies that games get a lot wrong in their sequels, but this is definitely a check in the win column for Crash. But back to gameplay. Once you complete a level, you're brought back to the central area for level selection. In Crash 1, it's a linear traversal through the Insanity Islands with a start and an end point at the final boss fight. The sequels, however, use a branching hub that gives you access to 5 levels that you can tackle at any order. This allows for some diverse gameplay experiences, as all of the levels within each hub room generally hang around the same difficulty. Whereas the first game gives you a beginning to end through line of level design ramping up in complexity, the sequels provide a varied experience through the environments, even more so in Crash 3 after the regular appearance of the vehicular segments. Speaking of which, you know what little conundrum always befuddled me? Franchises where the main characters are animals of some kind that also farm and use other animals for profit. Like, what kind of animals do people eat for meat in Pokemon? There are scenes in this show where the people are clearly seen eating meat, or the classic Krabby Patty paradox. What is this thing made of? It could be meat, but it also possibly couldn't be. But there are other very obviously vegetable-like things on the patty. So, following this same line of thought, why is Crash, a mutated bandicoot, shown domesticating other animals using them as transport? There's a wild hog in the first one, a polar bear cub in the second one, and in the third, not only an actual tiger, but a newly hatched dinosaur. Like, what? What are the rules of this world? Is it about intelligence? Is it a food chain thing? I somehow think a bear would be more capable than a bandicoot. Definitely a tiger. Though, we would later go on to actually fight and defeat a tiger. Twice. But a dinosaur? Anyway, riding an animal would become a staple for this franchise, as well as a few motorized transports, such as a surfboard with a motor on it, a jetpack, a motorcycle, and even a freaking submarine. These vehicle segments weren't a focus until the third game, where they went from these fun little segments to separate the platforming to actual long-term game design. Like, in the second game, the motor-powered surfboard was just a little gimmick for the river levels. The core experience was still platforming over a rushing river, but the surfboard provided a fun distraction and sped up the progression of the level so each stage didn't feel so monotonous. Compare this to the third game, where levels will start and stop with a vehicular approach. There are entire levels in the 5-stage warp rooms that take place on a jet ski or the Tiger or an airplane. Part of what made the vehicles fun, at least in my opinion, was that they were mainly temporary. They broke up the main gameplay loop and provided a little detour so that you never got bored with the stage. Granted, the hog in the first game was exactly like this, and even Crash 2 had the polar bear and jetpack sequences. But what I really appreciate about Crash 2 was that it had those separate stages for vehicles and vehicle integrated ones. For instance, imagine a jetpack level where you run through a room or two as Crash before hitting that airlock, then taking out the jetpack and those janky ass controls to finish the level, or just progress through it. Or in an ice level, you jump over a couple of icy hills and eradicate the penguin population, and then jump on the back of your polar bear shaped piggy bank and sped away through an iceberg, which, now that I say it out loud, had a similar level in it in the late game. This is an actual level that exists. It's the perfect combination of classic Crash gameplay. You got your run away from the hazard loop, but also an animal riding segment at the end to raise the stakes. I thought I came up with a new concept, but there it is, right there in 480p. But yeah, my point is, I think the levels where the vehicles are not the main focus of the levels are just more fun than the ones where they're the entire level design. Feels more like a mini game at that point than an actual game asset. And that's the basic gameplay of a Crash Bandicoot game. You jump over some pretty incredible terrain, spin attacking and sliding into enemies, picking up all the collectibles, and hitting that end portal to bring you back to your hub. Good stuff. Obviously, I like the design of 2 and 3 a lot more than 1, as it's pretty clunky and complicated to use, but every product has to start somewhere. Something simple and unpolished can and usually does turn into something pretty fantastic by the end, and I'd say that's where this franchise ended up in its core design elements. Look at this face. Look long and hard into the eyes of a mentally unstable bandicoot. What do you see within those deep, pitch-black pupils? Do you see peace? The harmonious existence of a perfect world? Do you see chaos? The unbridled rage of a being done horribly wrong? Well, let me tell you what I see. I see a story. One of evil and misfortune thrust upon unwilling souls, but those souls fought back, turning the tide against a grisly new world order. The ruler-to-be, banished from his cold steel throne, locked in an eternal battle of good versus evil. Also, there's these really cool magical masks, and like one's painted like a Rasta man, and the other's this ugly brown thing. Okay, look, the plot of this franchise isn't actually that complicated. These games ain't no Metal Gear, Kingdom Heart, The Great Frog Quest. So let's start at the beginning. This yellow thumb is Dr. Neo Cortex, an evil scientist bent on taking over the world. He uses his incredible intellect to build a machine meant to rapidly evolve animals into intelligent soldiers. Cortex plans on creating an army of these soldier animals with a bandicoot as his army's general. However, his initial experiment with the Evolvo Ray ends in failure, instead driving the bandicoot insane. The crazed bandicoot then yeets himself out the castle window to escape Cortex's clutches. However, not content with his failure, Cortex prepares Tana, a female bandicoot, as his second experiment and repairs the Evolvo Ray. Knowing that Cortex has to be stopped and ever the horn dog, Crash embarks on a journey through the Insanity Islands to take out the mad scientist and save his girlfriend. After taking out Cortex's animal brigade and making his way back to the castle, Crash's encounter with Cortex's right-hand man Embryo lights the castle aflame, leading to the climactic battle atop the scientist's blimp. It's here where the first game ends, with Cortex plummeting to the world below. Crash escapes the dilapidated castle with Tana as they ride off into the sunset. All in all, it's a pretty simple plot. Save the princess and all that. It gives you a reason to put yourself through the gauntlet that is Crash Bandicoot. What's pretty neat is that every game after would tack a little more onto the plot of the franchise, adding bits and pieces to give depth to the universe these games take place in. Continuing on, the second game starts right where the first left off. Cortex seemingly plumbing to his death. Somehow this guy completely absorbs the impact of falling from several hundred feet in the air into some cave. Inside that cave, Cortex discovers what he can only describe as crystals. Floating purple crystals. Somehow this sparks an idea for him, and as the light goes out in the cave, we get treated to a time skip. We suddenly arrive on a space station. We go from medieval castles and Frankenstein science to crystals and space stations. Okay, we discover Cortex has a new ally, the prestigious N-Jin, a master of mechanical engineering. He explains to Cortex, and by extension to us, that the crystal he found is a master crystal and needs 25 slave crystals in order to function properly as his new power source. Cortex then remarks about how he needs to use an enemy in order to fulfill his plan, which then menacingly fades to our hero Crash Bandicoot, resting comfortably with his newly introduced sister Coco Bandicoot. That's right, we completely traded in our female compatriot for another nerdier model. Anyway, Coco sends us to get a new battery for her laptop, but partway down the path we're whisked away into a radiant light. We end up inside this temple-looking place where a hologram of Cortex begins to speak to us. He demands that we assist him in collecting the crystals in each of the portals to help save the world. Being the insane little bandicoot that we are, we proceed to do this at his will, collecting crystals throughout the world. After picking up some gems among our crystal hunt, we're contacted by Brio, who gives us some interesting information. He's actually in a fight against Cortex, who was previously his ally. The gems we've been collecting on the side have the energy to power up a super laser to blow up Cortex's spaceship. So now we have this duality. Do we trust Cortex, our enemy, in saving the world, or do we trust Brio, also our enemy, but with a mutual grudge against Cortex? We don't actually have a real choice in the matter, as we have to collect the crystals in order to continue the game. Inevitably, we get cross with Cortex as we fight our way through the rogues gallery of mutant animals. We learn his true intent. Cortex has tricked us into collecting the 25 crystals for him to power his spaceship's laser. He plans on using it to hypnotize the people of the planet to take over the world. In another final encounter with Cortex, we chase him through an asteroid belt and send his Simpson reject ass packing. In this game's true ending, which you can only see by collecting the rest of the hidden gems, Brio is successful in creating and firing the laser that destroys the Cortex vortex. Once again, it's a pretty straightforward plot. I don't think anyone was actually fooled by the facade Cortex puts up in this game, especially since we get that scene at the beginning where he says he has to use an enemy to proceed with his plan, and the introduction of a true secret ending would be a regular staple of this franchise going forward. The final chapter in the trilogy takes a note from the second game and begins directly where the previous one leaves off. A fragment of the Cortex vortex falls out of the atmosphere and in a cruel twist of fate lands directly on top of some ancient ruins. Upon impact, a dark force is seen whooshing out of these ruins. A dark omen indeed. We discover that these last two encounters with Cortex have been ultimately the work of a masked spirit of his own. Uka Uka, the masked representative of evil, has been manipulating Cortex to do his bidding while he's locked away. Crash's masked spirit, Aku Aku, is his brother, the Mask of Good. Uka Uka has used his powers to summon a new scientist, one of theoretical physics, Dr. Entropy. With his powerful and intricate time twister, Cortex will send his recollected forces throughout time to collect the crystals needed to finally enslave the world. Aku Aku picks up on his brother's plans and decides to use their own technology against them. Crash and his sister Coco are to use the Time Twister to collect the crystals and take them back from Cortex before it's too late. Again, another straightforward plot, enhanced by newly added pseudoscience elements and fresh, interesting characters. Crash and Coco jump through different points in time, collecting crystals and gems to stop Cortex's plot. After you take out Uka Uka's forces and beat Cortex, he runs away with the help of Uka Uka, intent on seeking out the rest of the gems instead of using the crystals. So, naturally, your goal is to reach them before they do. This includes navigating new warp rooms and challenge courses, and after beating the evil ensemble again, you accidentally offset the Time Twister's powers. Aku Aku takes Crash away to safety, however the erupting time storm sends Cortex, Entropy, and Uka Uka not only to a distant past, but also reverses their ages to infantile form. And there they shall stay for years and years, letting our heroes rest until one day, where they inevitably shall escape once again. While there would be a direct follow-up to this game in Crash Bandicoot Wrath of Cortex, every game after this would be retconned by the newly released Crash 4 It's About Time, as each game happens in their own timelines. But we'll get into those games another time. Maybe. While this trilogy didn't necessarily have a direct, complete ending for our heroes, I don't think it needed to. Each game has a brief, simple plot that doesn't leave many doors open for interpretation. Everything happens as the developers intended them to. This means that they had a thought-out plan as to where they wanted to take the franchise while they owned it. Naughty Dog did a really good job at making sure the reason you picked up the game was for its core gameplay, not for some insanely detailed plot threads. And while the universe of the game walks a fine line between Frankenscience and mystic fantasy, you can tell that the game was designed to make sure it follows the rules its narrative present. Aside from the light retcon of Cortex being manipulated from the start, there isn't a whole lot the game's story tries to fix with its previous titles. You can really tell what era these games came from by two things: graphical quality and simple storytelling. I commend the first game specifically for not having to make some super convoluted story reason as to why Crash is taking his journey in the first place. Your love interest is in danger, so go rescue her. How much simpler can you get than that? Crash 2 had this plot where Cortex tries to trick Crash into doing his dirty work for him, and while it ultimately succeeds, it doesn't make much sense from a player perspective. As the player, we understand that Cortex is manipulating Crash from the start. He literally says so right as the prologue ends.
If we don't have any friends left on the surface, then we need to find an enemy.
So, the twist towards the end when Cortex gets his evil laugh in feels hollow. Because while Crash may be shocked by the reveal, or may not, we can't actually tell if he's surprised, we as the player controlling him have known all along. And because of the simple development at the time, there's really no way to approach the situation differently. If there was a way to double-cross Cortex before collecting the last crystal, or something like that, then I think the landing would have stuck better on the manipulation part. But to cut the game some slack, Crash 2 had the massive undertaking of making sure that it would be a deserving follow-up to one of the most iconic games of all time. I think the focus on its development spent way more time on the mechanical aspects of the game, not so much with its story. You gotta understand that these games were made for kids, man. I could say for sure that I didn't quite put all the pieces together until a few times after I played it. In that regard, I can generally let the bad plot slide. But I think the plot elements shine the most in Crash 3. It retroactively makes the previous games more interesting. At first, the audience is made to believe that Cortex is just this really ruthless dude that can't take a loss. But when it's discovered that he's actually the agent of a supreme force of evil, it slowly adds layers on each of their characters' design. Cortex, the instrument of destruction, accidentally gave birth to Crash, the scion of heroism. This crazy duality suddenly occurs and deepens the relationship between the creator and his creation, all from a simple villain reveal. And the plot itself, being a time travel story, allows for all sorts of shenanigans. While the game doesn't really play much on the potential of changing things throughout the timeline, that would later come much later in Crash 4, the Time Twister plays a pretty significant part in how the characters interact with each other, forcing our heroes to encounter the enemies on their preferred turf. giving the enemies just a bit more depth in their personalities. Crash 3's plot, which tries to be a conclusion but not really, feels like the most fleshed out as a concept. It's not simple like 1, and it's nowhere near as fumbled as 2, a nice perfect balance of goofy aesthetic and fantasy lore which really represents this game series as a whole. Now let's take a look at Crash's path. His pathing. The path that he takes. The level design in Crash Bandicoot is some of the most simple and also most interesting in platforming games. Most levels have different iterations of each other. That is, several levels have the same theme but are presented differently. For instance, there are a couple levels in Crash 1 that take place in these densely packed jungles, but the paths, colors, and hazards all change between them. They'll have the same themes like rolling rocks and crawling animals, but they won't be in the same placements. Crash 2 has these snow-covered levels in the Arctic that are broken up into 3 parts. The first part introduces the terrain, enemy types, and sets the expectation for difficulty. And while the subsequent snowy levels would maintain almost this copy-paste formula, the enemy placement and hazards changing makes it feel like you're within the same area as the other portals, but with this natural feeling of progression. Probably the best level design comes out of Crash 3 though, because on top of the now developed Crash level formula, the third game introduces power-ups into its level design, which can be detected very early on. Side paths, which usually contain hidden gems and additional boxes, can sometimes only be reached if you have a specific power-up. The double jump, helicopter spin, and Wompazooka all play roles in this development. This adds a replayability factor which entices the player to come back and go the extra mile to get all the collectible objects, which is needed to unlock the game's true extended ending. And while you could surely take this as a way to artificially extend the lifetime of your game, Crash makes it feel organic and each level is complex and fun in design, so it almost never feels like too much. At least to me anyway. Crash takes lengths to introduce players to its level design in every first level in each of the initial trilogy. To that end, let's check out each first level in each of the games really quick. After Crash is done eating a pile of sand, we get introduced to basic mechanics really quickly. Placed directly in front of us are 3 boxes, 2 of which look unlike the last. Right away, literally the first thing we are given is a trial and error learning experience. The game doesn't give you any button prompts, so it expects you to play with your controller to figure out what buttons do what action. So you figure out how to move with a D-pad, or DualShock if you're a little late to the party. If you play with the symbol buttons on the other side, you may figure out how to spin attack, or jump. This box has a cool symbol on it, so let's break that one open. Whoa! That's my face! So these are your 1-ups. They give you lives so you can die more times in a level. What happens if I jump onto the other boxes? Whoa! I'm bouncing! And I'm getting the apples, fuck yeah! And now, after encountering these 3 crates, before even making it off the beach, you've been introduced to the core collection mechanics of these games. There are crates with different designs throughout the levels, and each crate design contains different loot, and each box can be broken in different ways. Adventuring down the path introduces you to a simple enemy that strafes the corridor we're walking down. We can either dodge him completely, or interact with him with the mechanics you've learned breaking boxes a second ago. Jumping on and spin attacking enemies are both ways you can dispatch them. We'll learn later through controlled presentation that enemies can be taken care of in specific ways, but that's not until later. Directly under the crab is one of the other traversal hazards for our heroic marsupial.
Bottomless freaking pits.
Obviously, since the pit is pitch black and you don't want to fall forever into the void, you'll need to hurl yourself over there with a nicely timed jump. We're given an introduction to another mechanic here as well, a crate imprisoned Aku Aku. This gives us an extra hit point, which we can practice using on this crab, if you're a nincompoop. The game slowly ramps up the difficulty by giving us more hazards in succession, multiple pits, a couple of crabs, and an ascent into the jungle ruins. Pick up this second Aku crate and continue to your first checkpoint right in the middle of the level, and now you're given the coolest show of strength very early on into your playthrough.
Crackhead Bandicoot
Power! This crate gives you a third Aku mask, which initiates the invincibility form. While it doesn't save you from bottomless pits, it does make you impervious to enemy and environmental damage. Blitz your way through these enemies to be given what's going to be a regular occurrence in these games, multiple paths. Thankfully, each path is relatively short, and each one gives you some crates of Wumpa to collect. Make your way down either path and they'll join together again with a single pit left right before the goal. You're given a screen afterwards summarizing your progress thus far. If you didn't break all of the boxes in the level, you'll be given a box to the face for every one that you missed. And while this seems pretty novel, this feature is actually unique to only the first game. Later games would introduce a box count you can keep track of at the top of the screen by pressing a button. And speaking of later games, let's check out Crash 2's first level. And actually, we don't have a whole complete level to start the game. We're given an actual tutorial level to finish instead. This is actually a breath of fresh air, because the way Crash moves has also been vamped up. Crash has been given much more freedom of movement, more fluid animation, and some new controls as well. So, being a sequel, we know at least a few things that Crash is capable of. We got 8 directions of movement using the D-pad or analog stick. We can jump, spin attack, but pressing the circle button does something new. Crash can crouch now? If we press the circle button while moving, we actually commit to a slide move, which can help cover distance and also attack enemies. So, with these new controls under our belt, let's navigate our tutorial. Again, we're given our crate interaction. We see a bouncy crate, which still gives us 10 Wumpas before breaking, and a simple crate, which gives us more. Directly after is a decent little touch I appreciate very much, our first pit. Except this isn't as life or death as the first game's pit. This one you can see the bottom of. This offers a no-stakes jumping tutorial, giving you plenty of time to test out just how adept your jumping is. Using the jump button, you can accurately gauge how far and high you can jump without worrying about falling to your death. Overkill this little sandbox and you're introduced to your old pal Aku Aku, followed immediately by an enemy.
The strafing rat boy.
Spin attack or jump on this enemy to dispatch it and carry on. An actual bottomless pit appears on the right, and navigating past it gives you a 1-up crate and a mandatory bottomless pit encounter to jump over. While I traverse this next part, I just want to say that I personally appreciate how this game lays out its mechanics for you before actually exposing you to the dangers of this game. Before you're shown an actual bottomless pit, it gives you a sandbox to leap over. Before a single enemy comes around, you're given a one-hit mask so you don't die and lose a life right away. It all feels very deliberate. Being a tutorial means you're given the mechanics over time so you can understand them clearly. It's a really nice gesture and follows through on some time-tested game design. Anyway, walk into this circle of light and get whisked away to Cortex's shenanigans. In my personal opinion, this is probably the best version of a tutorial you could be given. The mechanics are all laid out before you in a safe environment before you're put into some actual danger and are given the ability to traverse them yourself. What I see a lot of video game tutorials nowadays do is put you up in a room with an invasive text prompt or a voice on screen that explains the mechanics of the game out to you. What makes it worse is that these tutorials aren't even given to you in a sandbox-like nature, with little to no stakes. They course correct really hard, starting the tutorial over again or forcing you outright to perform the mechanic, or you just can't go any further. The player of your tutorial should be given the freedom to play with your mechanics before being introduced to an environment where they're essential to pass. Games that have tutorials be an actual level are some of the worst guides, but are also some of the worst levels. You want to be able to engage with the environment, but if you aren't shown how, you'll be having a rough time adjusting to the rest of your game. But if your first experience with the environment is the tutorial, then you'll be unable to immerse yourself in the rest of the game because you'll always treat each level as a scripted event, which may be okay for some games, like the frickin' Oregon Trail or something. But in the world building games and narrative experiences we have nowadays, you don't want to wind up with text on screen the entire time telling you how your game works. You should be able to be given an environment where the player is encouraged to, play. Some of the better tutorials for games I can remember are Five Nights at Freddy's, Half-Life, Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, Dead Space, and this game, Crash 2. I could continue to sing this tutorial's praises for hours. Which is kind of funny because its follow-up, Crash 3, has absolutely no tutorial or intro whatsoever. You're thrust immediately into the game from the first level. The game starts in the warp room, so you have a bit of time to get readjusted to the movement controls. But being the third game in the franchise, the game decides you don't need that period of learning and assumes you know how to play as Crash Bandicoot, which in itself isn't a bad thing. This is the third game in the franchise, and they're all functionally the same. What you can be sure of though is that Crash 3 is careful to explain any new mechanics whenever they're implemented, such as vehicle controls and power-ups. When you enter the first warp area, the buttons for the portals will appear on the floor. Each button is labeled so you can clearly see that the one the game wants you to start from. Toad Village. Alright, great, let's eat this week. After getting thrown through time-space, we're finally given a taste of the environments for this game. Following the predecessor's follow the path design, we're given some crates to break, followed by a crack in the road. This is some neat little design, which I appreciate. The first level throws a puddle of water on the path, breaking up the terrain and visually telling us that the roads won't always be whole. You knew that already, supposedly, if you've played the previous two games, but it gives you some safety so that way you don't fall into a pit before you're given the actual first roadblock to jump onto. A bit down the road is a fallen log to leap over, followed by our obligatory strafing enemy type, this time, a goat. You travel through the flooded road this time, collecting wumpas and committing more property damage as you go. Aku is hanging out in boxes again, and we give him a hand out of there. Our first real bottomless pit on the left, and we hit our first checkpoint. After establishing a new food chain with the local goat population, we are introduced to our first new mechanic, the shifting box faces. Spinning into this box with whatever face on the side gives you that item. A crash face gives you a 1-up, a question mark gives you a ton of wumpa fruit, and the blank face gets you nothing. But you need to break this box regardless, as if you leave it for too long it turns into a steel box that is impossible to break. Head down this path a ways and you'll find the level complexity, even within the first level, has started to advance dramatically. Boxes stacked super high to encourage you to use the crouch slide jump, enemies with timed windows of vulnerability, and bottomless pits in between it all. And since it's your first numbered level, you're given access to a bonus stage as well. Complete the bonus level and proceed through more of the classic Crash gameplay. There isn't too much to explain here since it's just the regular game design. Spin away the frogs and goats, pick up the wumpas and crystal here and try not to fall into the center of the earth. Reach the end of the level, pick up the gem if you've broken every box, and throw yourself back into the time void. Pretty good stuff. Overall, I think Crash 3 has the weakest first level in terms of introductory game design. It does introduce the mechanics to you in a safe manner for all but the first few seconds, whereas the second game gives you the capacity to screw up after approaching them. The third doesn't really bother you to hold your hand that much, but I also don't believe that's a bad thing. Crash 3 is exactly that, the third game in the franchise. It goes with the premise that you've already played the first two and are aware of the mechanics the previous two have introduced to you. It doesn't feel the need to hold your hand because you've already been through that. You're older now. Crash is more battle hardened, so theoretically the two of you should know the routine by now. The first level in Crash 3 starts out in a safe manner here, but that safety quickly dwindles away as you're given hazards and roadblocks to overcome fairly quickly. Certainly a first level befitting the third game in a platforming series. Crash Bandicoot has level design that is both creative and technical, pulling off some pretty intricate visual mechanic comprehension very early on in 3D game development. While games like Super Mario and Banjo-Kazooie would go about making their platformers in an open world environment, Crash Bandicoot sought to make itself the king of 2D level design in a 3D space. Giving the player freedom to explore and to experiment with movement and interaction led to one of the best feeling experiences the PS1 had to offer, and even modern games have a hard time replicating. What is a video game without its soundtrack? A platformer without its sound effects. Perhaps just as fun as its visual design is Crash Bandicoot's audio design. The developers once stated while designing the Crash trilogy that they wanted to imbue the games with the sensation of watching a Saturday morning cartoon. Crash himself is supposed to be that of a Looney Tunes reject character. It's why the character models and level design are so stretchy and vibrant in their colors. Even Crash's signature Woah was created with this in mind. They didn't want him to actually have a voice. They'd save that for the people he encountered in the world. But the running, movement, and death animations were all done in an attempt to simulate this feeling. Similarly, the game contains some of the most iconic sound effects for the PS1 era. To this day, the crystal/gem collection sound is still my text notification tone. Crash's Woah was memed to death not that too long ago, and I guarantee that if you make that noise in public, most people would tell you where that came from. The cartoony punching and swiping sound effects are ingrained throughout the game, making every enemy spun away a memorable moment. The ambient noises of the environments, while not entirely stand out, are quality in their own right. Seals make barking noises, robots are sparking electricity, and the sounds the goons make when you spin them away are... well, they're memorable to say the least. Horrifying. Combined with the character behaviors, the sound effects are definitely add a layer of cartoonic quality onto them. As with every Saturday morning cartoon, you have a wonderfully nostalgic soundtrack to go with it. Crash has some of the most creative music in early video gaming. One of the most infuriating things about video games and early gaming to me was that when the soundtrack got relegated to tinny bips and bops and were very obviously electronic replications of real instruments. Games that had full access to real instruments but opted to go for the soundboard version instead just come off as lazy and incomplete. The only excusable versions of these are anything before the 5th generation of consoles, the Atari, the NES, Genesis, etc. That being said, Crash had a regular amount of actual musical scores in the game. Josh Mansell composed the soundtrack for Crash 1, 2, and 3. He would later go on to create the soundtracks for the Jak and Daxter franchise with Larry Hopkins. Mansell was even later nominated for 2 Daytime Emmy Awards for his work on the Clifford the Big Red Dog cartoon. Attaboy, Josh. The first Crash game had a linear progression through a map of levels, so the music in the first game is actually a lot more varied. There are very few levels that share the same background music. Usually only 1 or 2 levels have the same theme. I want to commend the first game for this, as it was likely a very arduous task to come up with so many original concepts in what was already a flagship title for a new game design studio. The sequels would have levels in each warp room that would share the same theme with some in the previous one. For instance, there are 2 jungle levels in the first warp room of Crash 2, and all the way in the final warp room is another one, this time at night. But all stages share the same soundtrack right down to the bonus level theme. Crash 3 is a little less hard-hitting with it, with one level theme usually carrying over into the next warp room. That being said, each game wants each level to have its own identity, which I think is best carried over in its soundtrack. No 2 stage themes sound alike, they each have their own vibe. From the chaotic percussion in the jungle levels, to the seasonally appropriate sleigh bells of the snow levels, to the twangy strings running along the Great Wall of China. Each theme has an atmosphere that suits the levels that they're in, with some pretty standout tracks in each game. Some of my personal favorites are Upstream from Crash 1, Sewer or Later from Crash 2, and Tomb Time from Crash 3. One thing I will note about the soundtrack design is that while the themes fit the levels that they're in, Crash 1's does overall feel like a more ambient tone was taken when designing the music. Instruments aren't as pronounced, and aside from a rhythm, most tracks don't have an outstanding instrument leading them. Take for example the theme from the level Cortex Power. It's a pretty mellow bass line, but compare it to a similar level in design like Piston It Away from Crash 2 or Future Frenzy from Crash 3. Which have very obvious leading instruments and a melody to them. I get the feeling that they were going for a more atmospheric tone with the first game to promote its adventure theme, but I can't help but notice it when I compare these games. The soundtrack is a major part of a video game for me. If a game is memorable to me, it's usually because it had a soundtrack that bangs on top of the gameplay and the story that it was trying to tell. When I think about the Crash series, I think that in general the audio design peaked with Crash 2 and was maintained well in 3. I have maybe 2 tracks for Crash 1 on an OST playlist, whereas I maybe have 3 or 4 from each of its sequels. That's not to say that the first game's soundtrack is bad by any means. All 3 of the games maintain a level of quality that fits each game well. All I'm saying is that 2 and 3's soundtrack was just more memorable for me. I think it's fair to say that Crash Bandicoot had a massive impact on gaming society. It was a crazy time for mascot platforming. The 5th console generation was chock full of different franchises doing their best to be the most representative of Sony, Nintendo, and Sega. Massive franchises were spearheaded hoping to catch the limelight of at-home gaming at its finest. No longer was video gaming this thing you did on lunky machines out in the arcades of the neighborhood. You could get high quality 3D models in your video games right on your home TV. I remember specifically Crash being everywhere. He had regular game trailers, demos in Pizza Hut promotions, fursuits, and that really cringe animated short for Crash 2. There's this really awesome documentary video from the development staff of Crash Bandicoot on a channel called Ars Technica about how they actually took apart the first PlayStation in order to develop the toolkit that wound up making the game. I'll link it in the description below. It's definitely worth a watch. Gavin goes into massive detail about the intricacies about how exactly they went about developing a new franchise for Sony and the effort it took to actually make the game good. Crash really was a labor of love. Naughty Dog went to the extreme to put their name on gaming history. While Crash doesn't have the serial publicity that Mario went on to have, I still believe you could end up in whatever country around the world, show somebody a picture of that orange marsupial and get a reaction of some kind. The original Crash Bandicoot trilogy is still held in high regard as one of the pioneering platforming icons, and lots of game design is still based around how this franchise was developed. And while the reputation of Crash would waver on and off the following decade, the legacy would be felt much further on into games of other franchises as well. This trilogy, in my humble opinion, is one of the foundational blocks of modern video games. While we may not have massive action platforming titles today dominating the market anymore, anytime that you peer into a video game and see a fantastical, whimsical landscape, or far-fetched Frankenstein science, or a goofy little talking animal character, there's a little bit of Crash Bandicoot's essence thriving within that game. A little bit of legacy carried on by anyone and everyone who ever broke a crate, jumped on a turtle, or rode a dinosaur like a cowboy. Whenever I get done a long binge of really complicated immersive titles like The Last of Us, Kingdom Hearts, or God of War, I always like to decompress by booting up my old PS1 and throwing in a copy of one of these games. Being able to get in touch with my inner child is priceless. And while I'm able to experience creativity through video games as an art medium, nothing makes me smile quite as much as genuinely as seeing this little rascal whisk himself and me off onto another adventure. Much love and many thanks to the amazing staff, both formerly and currently at Naughty Dog, for creating these childhood classics. My formative years were much more fun thanks to the incredibly talented engineers and designers that dared to explore, break boundaries, and create something others had only dreamed of until that point. They bent over backwards to understand this new foreign technology. Their ridiculous workload transformed into something amazing, something incredibly unique. I could never thank them enough. If you're stuck in a video game funk with nothing to play, go pick up these games. The PS3 has a shaky timeline as to when they'll be pulling the PSN down, and right now that's the most modern console with a way to play them. Or you could pick up the Insane trilogy for the PS4, which is a pretty faithful recreation of those games. But I do find that some of the charm was taken away when they decided to emulate the game feel on a modern engine. Either way, it's an enjoyable experience and I can't tell you enough times to play them. Now, if you'll excuse me, I still have to get through that crackpot death route in Cold Hard Crash from Crash 2. Can't believe they're making me break 155 boxes for 2 gems. What do you mean there's a level with 502 in Crash 4? Hey there, lads and ladies. If you're still watching this, I just want to say a big thank you for watching this video. I've wanted to make a video essay like this for so long, but I've never been in the right place to do such a thing. I want to give a special shout out to some channels that I've been binge watching recently that inspired me to make this video. BlueKunai made an amazingly thorough 2-part in-depth retrospective of the Tomba series. SteakBentley's 3-hour critically deconstructed video on Metal Gear Solid 4. JebTube and AskYourUncle each made expansive video essays completely tearing apart Kingdom Hearts 3. Lextoria and his wonderful insight into the anime community. YourFavoriteSon just recently finished a full retrospective series on the Dead Space franchise, hyping me up for the remake. And NightlyBreadswords' entire channel. Love this guy. But I plan on doing many more of these kinds of videos for the upcoming year. I have an entire release schedule planned out that I'll go into more depth on in another video. If you thought this retrospective was worth watching, let me know with a like and tell me what your favorite part was in the comments below. If there was something you didn't like or that I can improve upon, please let me know as well. I want these videos to be as fun to watch as I could possibly make them. Consider hitting the subscribe button for the next episode in Sequelogical Tendencies and some other stuff I can create here. And last but not least, share this with your friends. Do you have a friend who won't stop talking about this franchise, or who has a strong opinion about these games? Send them my way. I'd love to hear what they have to say. Thanks again for staying this long, and I hope to see you again sometime. Excelsior.